A man is walking alone on a quiet road just before sunrise. No noise, no crowd, no distraction, only his footsteps. At first, everything feels normal. The ground is solid, the direction is clear, his thoughts are familiar. But then something strange happens. He stops for a moment and looks at his own hand, and for a brief second, he does not recognize it as his. Not because it changed, but because his sense of ownership over it suddenly feels thin, almost imagined. He tries to shake the feeling off and continues walking. But now every step feels slightly different. Not because the road changed, but because something inside him is no longer as certain as before. He starts thinking, am I walking forward, or is everything just passing through me? The thought unsettles him, so he looks around for something stable. The trees are still there, the sky is still there, the world looks the same, but his mind is no longer placing itself inside it in the same way. And then, in a very quiet moment, it hits him. Nothing around him has changed, but his grip on everything has loosened without permission. This is the strange truth Buddhism points to. Not that the world disappears, but that your certainty about the world is always more fragile than you realize. And once that certainty starts to loosen, even the most ordinary moment begins to feel like you are seeing life for the very first time. And in that space, brother and sister, the mind quietly learns something it was always avoiding. Nothing was ever as solid as it felt. You are not what you think you are holding, because what you call you is already slipping away without permission. You need to understand something very deeply, not just intellectually, but in a way that quietly shakes your assumptions about yourself. Right now, you are living under a hidden misunderstanding. You believe that you are the things you hold on to. Your thoughts, your memories, your relationships, your identity, your emotions, your past, your plans. Slowly, without even noticing, you have built your entire sense of self on these shifting things. But here is what you are not seeing. Everything you are holding is already changing, and because it is changing, the you built on it is also changing without your permission. You are not as stable as you think you are, and this is where the teaching begins. In the Buddhist understanding, what you call self is not a fixed object. It is not something solid that exists independently. It is a process, a flow, a constantly changing combination of thoughts, sensations, emotions, and perceptions. But the mind does something very subtle. It takes this flow and tries to freeze it into an identity. It says, "This is me." It collects experiences and builds a story. "This is my life. This is who I am. This is what I have been through. This is what I want to become." And slowly, you begin to believe the story is real. But the truth is more uncomfortable. Even as you are trying to define yourself, everything inside you is already shifting. Your thoughts from a few seconds ago are gone. Your emotional state is not the same as it was earlier today. Your desires are not identical to what they were last year. Even your personality changes depending on who you are with, where you are, and what is happening around you. So when you say, "I am like this," you are describing a moment that is already disappearing. Now notice something deeper. The things you are holding on to define yourself are also not stable. The person you love today may not stay the same tomorrow. The memory that gives you comfort today may lose its emotional weight in the future. The identity you are proud of today can be challenged, changed, or even broken by a single unexpected event. Nothing you rely on to say "this is me" remains untouched by time. And yet you keep building your identity on these unstable things. This is why suffering becomes inevitable, because you are trying to make something permanent out of something that is designed to change. The Buddha pointed directly to this and said that clinging to impermanent things as if they are permanent is the root of suffering. Not because life is cruel, but because your expectations are disconnected from reality. You are asking the river to stop flowing so you can stand on it, and when it does not stop, you feel betrayed. But the river was never meant to stop. Now understand something very important. You are not being told to reject life or stop caring. That is not the teaching. You are being asked to see clearly what is happening while it is happening. Right now, even as you read this, Your mind is trying to hold on to a sense of, I am the one reading this. But that sense is also arising and disappearing moment by moment. There is no permanent reader here. There is only reading happening. There is no fixed thinker, only thoughts appearing and fading. But because the mind wants stability, it creates a false center and calls it me. This false center is what you are protecting all the time without knowing it. When someone criticizes you, it feels like they are attacking you. When someone praises you, it feels like they are confirming you. When something changes in your life, it feels like your life is being disturbed. But what is actually being disturbed is not a solid self. It is an idea you are clinging to. Now go deeper into your everyday experience. Think about a moment when you were very angry. In that moment, you felt like that anger was you. But later, when the anger disappeared, you did not say, I am anger. You separated from it. You said, I was angry. So where did the anger go? Did you remove it? Or did it simply arise, stay for a while, and disappear on its own? Now think about happiness. When you are happy, you feel that happiness strongly. But that too passes. And when it passes, you do not say, I am happiness. You say, I was happy. This shows something very important. What you call you is not any single emotion or thought. It is the awareness in which all of them appear and disappear. But instead of recognizing this, the mind grabs certain experiences and says, this is mine, this defines me, I will hold on to this. And that is where tension begins. Because nothing in experience agrees to be held permanently. Even your body is changing. Cells are renewing, sensations are shifting, energy levels rise and fall. The body you call me today is not the exact same body you had years ago. So if everything you call you is constantly changing, then what exactly are you holding on to? This is the question the Buddha wants you to sit with, not to confuse you, but to free you from a false burden. Because when you believe you are something fixed, you start fearing change. You start fearing loss. You start fearing uncertainty. You try to protect what cannot be protected. You try to control what cannot be controlled. And slowly, life becomes exhausting. But when you begin to see that there is nothing solid to defend, something changes inside you. You stop fighting reality. You stop trying to freeze life. You begin to notice that everything is simply moving on its own. Thoughts come and go. People come and go. Emotions come and go, situations come and go, and you are not outside of this movement. You are part of it, not as a fixed identity, but as awareness in which it all happens. This is not something you can fully grasp in one moment. It is something you slowly begin to see through repeated reflection and honest observation. And the more clearly you see it, the less tightly you hold, because you realize something simple but powerful. If nothing is truly fixed, then nothing real can be lost. Only forms change, only appearances shift. But what is aware of all of it does not need to be defended. So when you hear the statement, you are not what you think you are holding, it is not a poetic idea, it is a direct challenge to your current way of existing. Because right now, you are living as if your identity is something you must constantly protect. But what if there is nothing to protect at all? What if the you are defending is just a temporary pattern of experience, not a permanent entity? If you begin to see even a glimpse of this, attachment starts to loosen naturally, not because you force it, but because it no longer makes sense to hold on to what is already moving. And in that quiet understanding, something very subtle begins to happen. Life continues, but the fear of losing it begins to fade. Everything you depend on feels stable until you notice it was leaving you the entire time without warning. You are living inside a very convincing illusion, and the strange part is that nothing in your daily life forces you to question it. In fact, everything around you reinforces it. That illusion is this: what you depend on feels stable. People feel stable. Relationships feel stable. Your body feels stable. Your thoughts feel stable. Your future feels like it is building in a predictable direction. But this stability is not real. It is only a feeling created by short moments of continuity. And because the mind prefers comfort over truth, It ignores everything that contradicts this feeling until one day something changes and you suddenly realize something you were never paying attention to. Everything was already leaving you the entire time, without warning, without permission, without asking you, not suddenly, not dramatically, but silently, continuously, moment by moment. The Buddha pointed directly at this hidden truth. Everything conditioned is impermanent. But what most people miss is how subtle this impermanence really is. It is not only about death or big losses. It is happening in the smallest details of your experience. You think your relationships are stable, but even in a single conversation, the tone changes, the mood shifts. The feeling between two people is never exactly the same from one second to the next. What you call the same person is actually a changing stream of moments. You think your emotions are stable, but even sadness does not stay pure. It fluctuates, it weakens, strengthens, transforms into thought, then disappears into distraction, then returns in a different form. You think your thoughts are stable, but you cannot hold a single thought without it dissolving into the next one. Try to catch one thought and freeze it. You cannot. It is already gone before you can fully grasp it. Yet your mind creates a false impression of continuity, like frames in a film appearing so fast that they look like one solid picture. This is how your entire life feels stable, even though it is not. Now here is where suffering begins, because you are not just observing this movement. You are attaching your safety, your identity, and your emotional survival to it. You depend on people staying the same. You depend on situations not changing. You depend on your health remaining predictable. You depend on your inner state being controllable. But none of these things ever agreed to stay. They only appeared stable because your attention was not watching closely enough. Imagine standing next to a flowing river at night. In the darkness, the surface looks still. You might even believe the water is not moving. But the moment light touches it, you see the constant motion. Your life is like that river. In the darkness of assumption, it feels stable. In the light of awareness, it is always moving. And when you finally see this movement clearly, something uncomfortable arises at first, because the mind interprets stability as safety, and it interprets change as danger. So when you begin to notice that nothing is actually stable, the mind reacts with fear. It says, if everything is changing, then nothing is safe. But this is a misunderstanding. Change is not the problem. Your expectation of permanence is the problem. You suffer not because life moves, but because you expected it not to move. You suffer not because people change, but because you believed they would stay emotionally fixed in a way that suits your attachment. You suffer not because your body ages, but because you secretly assumed it would remain under your control. The Buddha did not say life is unstable to frighten you. He said it so you could stop building your peace on something that cannot hold it. Now look more deeply into your own experience. Think of someone you trusted deeply in the past. At that time, they felt stable in your mind. You could not imagine them changing in a way that would affect your connection. But time passed and something shifted. Maybe their behavior changed. Maybe your understanding of them changed. Maybe the circumstances changed. But the point is not the story itself. The point is your realization afterward. You look back and say, I never saw it coming. But the truth is, it was always moving. You just did not notice the movement. This is how attachment deceives you. It makes temporary stability feel permanent until the change becomes undeniable. And by the time you notice it, you are already emotionally invested in something that has been quietly changing all along. Now apply this to your own identity. The person you were years ago is not here anymore. Not just physically, but mentally, emotionally, even in the way you perceive the world. Your preferences have shifted. Your reactions have changed. Your understanding has deepened, or sometimes confused itself in new ways. Yet you still say, I am the same person. But what exactly is the same? The content of your mind is not the same. Your body is not the same. Your experiences are not the same. What remains is only a sense of continuity. not an actual unchanging substance. And that sense of continuity is what you call stability, but it is fragile because it depends on memory, attention, and interpretation. If memory weakens, identity feels unstable. If attention shifts, emotional reality changes. If interpretation breaks, the entire sense of self can feel threatened. This is why unexpected change feels so disturbing. Not because change is unnatural, but because it exposes the fact that nothing was ever as stable as you believed. Now go even deeper. The most painful attachments are not to things that are obviously temporary. They are to things that feel reliable, a close relationship that feels emotionally safe, a routine that gives comfort, a belief system that gives meaning, a role in life that gives identity. These are the things you lean on, and because they support your sense of stability, you treat them as if they will always remain in the same form. But slowly, without announcing itself, change enters. A person grows distant, a situation evolves, a belief becomes questioned, a role loses its meaning, and suddenly, what you depended on feels like it was taken away. But in truth, it was never taken. It was moving the entire time. You were just not seeing it. This is the key insight of this lesson. Nothing stable is being lost. Only your assumption of stability is being corrected by reality. Now when you see this clearly, something very important begins to shift inside you. You stop expecting life to remain still. You stop demanding permanence from what is naturally flowing, and most importantly, you stop building your inner safety on things that are designed to change. This does not mean you stop living or caring. It means you stop being shocked when life behaves exactly as it always has. Everything you depend on feels stable only until awareness reveals its movement. And once you see that movement clearly, you cannot unsee it. You begin to understand that life was never breaking your stability. It was showing you that stability was never there to begin with. And in that understanding, the grip begins to loosen. Not because you lost something, but because you finally saw it clearly while it was still changing in front of you. What you call love may actually be fear in disguise. And once you see it, nothing feels the same again. You have been taught to think that love is always pure, always noble, always selfless. But what you have never been asked to examine is something much more uncomfortable. What if a large part of what you call love is not love at all? What if it is fear, carefully disguised so you would never question it? This is not meant to destroy your understanding of love. It is meant to strip away everything false that has been attached to it, so you can finally see clearly, because in Buddhist understanding, anything that is built on attachment carries suffering within it. And most human love, as it is commonly experienced, is deeply entangled with attachment. You do not just love people, you depend on them. You do not just care, you fear losing. You do not just connect, you hold on. And the moment holding begins, fear quietly enters through the back door. At first, it does not feel like fear. It feels like intensity. It feels like closeness. It feels like meaning. But underneath that emotional intensity is a very simple movement of the mind. I do not want to lose this. And once that thought enters, love is no longer free. It becomes conditioned by anxiety. Now you are not simply with a person. You are managing the possibility of losing them. Now you are not simply enjoying connection. You are monitoring it. Now you are not simply present. You are calculating how to preserve what is already changing. And without realizing it, love becomes effort. But real love does not feel like effort in the way attachment does. Attachment tightens. Love expands. Attachment clings. Love allows. Attachment says, stay the same. Love understands everything changes. But the human mind often confuses emotional intensity with love itself. The stronger the feeling, the more real it seems. The more fear involved, the deeper it feels. The more dependency created, the more important it appears. So you begin to build entire emotional worlds around people, situations, and identities, thinking this intensity is proof of love. But intensity alone is not truth. Fire is intense, but it can burn what it touches. Now look carefully at your own experience. When you say you love someone, notice what happens inside you when you imagine losing them. There is pain, there is resistance, there is panic, there is a tightening in the chest, a collapse in the mind, a refusal to even mentally accept separation. And in that moment, what you feel is not love itself. It is fear of absence, fear of change, fear of being left without what your mind has attached itself to. This is where the illusion becomes very subtle, because fear can feel like love when it is directed towards something you value. The mind says, "I care so deeply, that is why it hurts." But Buddhism asks you to go deeper than that surface explanation. It asks, does it hurt because of love? Or does it hurt because of attachment to permanence in something impermanent? When you begin to observe closely, you notice something very revealing. The more you depend on someone emotionally, the more fragile your peace becomes in their absence. Your mood starts to depend on their attention. Your stability depends on their behavior. Your sense of self becomes entangled with how they respond to you. And slowly, without realizing it, your emotional life is no longer yours. It is shared, controlled, or disturbed by external movement. This is not love in its pure form. This is dependency shaped by fear of separation. And fear is always focused on one thing: holding what cannot be held. Now consider this carefully. If love is real, why does it turn into suffering the moment distance appears? If love is stable, why does it collapse so easily when change happens? If love is freedom, why does it often feel like emotional imprisonment? The Buddha's teaching does not deny connection. It does not deny affection. It does not deny human closeness. It simply asks you to see whether what you are calling love is actually freedom, or whether it is attachment wearing a beautiful name. Because attachment always introduces control, even if subtle. You begin to expect, you begin to assume, you begin to create invisible rules about how the other person should behave so your emotional state remains safe. And when reality does not follow those expectations, suffering arises. Not because something wrong happened, but because something impermanent refused to stay fixed. Now go even deeper. Think about how much of your emotional energy is spent protecting what you care about, protecting relationships, protecting identity within those relationships, protecting the feeling of being needed, valued, or understood. This protection is not love itself. It is the mind trying to prevent loss, and the more you try to prevent loss, the more you live in fear of it. So even in moments of closeness, there is a hidden tension, a subtle anxiety that says, "Do not let this change," but everything in existence is already changing. So you are constantly fighting reality in the name of preserving connection. And this is why even strong emotional bonds often contain suffering, because they are built on something the mind cannot guarantee: permanence. Now here is the deeper shift. When you begin to see that what you called love has often been mixed with fear, something inside you becomes disoriented at first, because the identity of being someone who loves deeply starts to break down. But what is actually breaking is not love itself. It is the illusion that love requires possession. Once that illusion weakens, something very different becomes possible. You start to relate without gripping. You start to care without controlling. You start to be present without constantly trying to preserve the moment. And this is where Buddhist understanding becomes very clear. Real love is not what binds you tighter. Real love is what allows you to see clearly without distortion from fear. But to reach that clarity, you must first be willing to admit something uncomfortable. That much of what felt like love was actually the mind trying to secure its own emotional safety through attachment. And once you see this clearly, something irreversible begins to happen inside you. Relationships do not disappear. Feelings do not vanish. But the desperation begins to fade. The panic begins to reduce. The need to control begins to loosen. And in that space, something quieter appears. A form of connection that does not depend on ownership, a form of care that does not collapse when things change, a form of presence that does not demand permanence from impermanence. And once you recognize this difference, you can never fully return to the old confusion again, because now you know what was love and what was fear wearing its name. The moment you start letting go, your mind turns against you, because it is losing the only thing it knows. When you begin the path of letting go, something unexpected happens. It is not peace at first. It is resistance, and that resistance does not come from the outside world. It comes from inside your own mind. The same mind that once convinced you that holding on was safety now begins to attack the very idea of release. It does not happen loudly in the beginning. It starts subtly. A thought appears. Why are you doing this? Another thought follows. You are becoming careless. Then another. You are losing something important. And slowly, these thoughts begin to multiply, until letting go itself feels like danger. This is the moment most people misunderstand the process and turn back. But what is actually happening is very important to see clearly. Your mind is not protecting truth. It is protecting familiarity. The Buddha pointed directly to this behavior of the mind. It clings not because what it holds is true, but because it is known. Even suffering, when familiar, feels safer than uncertainty. So when you start releasing attachment, you are not just letting go of people, memories, or expectations. You are disrupting the entire internal system that was built around clinging, and that system reacts. Now understand this deeply. Your mind has learned a very specific survival strategy over time. Attach, define, control, repeat. Attach to identity so you feel stable. Define experiences so you feel certain. Control outcomes so you feel safe. Repeat patterns so you feel predictable continuity. This system has been running for so long that it now believes it is you. So when you begin to let go, it interprets it as a threat to its existence, and it responds the only way it knows how, by generating fear. Fear disguised as logic, fear disguised as memory, fear disguised as concern, fear disguised as self-protection. But underneath all of it is one simple message: I am losing control. And the mind does not tolerate the loss of control easily, because control is what it believes keeps you together. But what it does not understand is that what it is trying to keep together was never truly stable in the first place. Now, as you go deeper into letting go, something more intense begins to surface. Old thoughts return, old emotions rise, old attachments that you thought were already weakened suddenly reappear with surprising strength. You may feel like you are going backward, but you are not going backward. You are simply seeing what was already there beneath the surface. Because letting go does not remove attachment instantly, it reveals it. The Buddha described this as the process of seeing clearly rather than escaping. And seeing clearly is not always comfortable. When light enters a dark room for the first time, you do not just see beauty, you see dust that was always there. In the same way, when awareness increases, you begin to see the hidden layers of attachment that were previously unconscious. Now the mind reacts again. It says, this is too much. It says, go back to how things were. It says, you were better when you were not thinking like this. And this is the critical moment, because this is where the illusion tries to restore itself. It offers you comfort in exchange for blindness. It offers you emotional stability in exchange for returning to unconscious attachment. And if you are not careful, you will interpret this discomfort as a sign that letting go is wrong. But in truth, it is a sign that letting go is working. Because anything that loses its grip will create friction at first. Now go deeper into this experience. When you begin detaching from something you depended on, notice what happens inside your thinking. The mind starts constructing arguments. It tries to convince you that you need certain attachments to function. It brings memories to strengthen emotional ties. It exaggerates the importance of certain relationships, roles, or identities. It creates fear-based scenarios about what life would look like without them. And all of this is not truth. It is defense of a system that does not want to dissolve. But here is what you must understand very clearly. The mind is not your enemy, but it is not your guide either. It is a conditioned mechanism that operates based on past patterns. And those patterns are built around attachment. So when you disrupt attachment, you are disrupting its operating system. And of course it resists. But resistance is not evidence that you are doing something wrong. It is evidence that something deeply ingrained is being questioned. Now something very important begins to emerge in this stage. You start to notice that the voice in your head is not always aligned with reality. It exaggerates, it distorts, it predicts loss where there is only change. It interprets uncertainty as danger, and slowly you begin to see that you are not the voice itself. You are the one who is aware of the voice. This realization is subtle, but it is powerful, because the moment you see the mind as something you can observe, rather than something you must obey, the grip begins to loosen. But the mind will not accept this easily. It will try to pull you back into identification. It will say, if you are not me, then who are you? And this question creates confusion, because the mind cannot understand awareness that is separate from its own activity. So it tries to reassert itself as the center of identity. But in letting go, you begin to see that identity was never as fixed as it claimed to be. It was a continuous stream of thoughts that created the illusion of a single self. Now, as this understanding deepens, something else becomes noticeable. The emotional intensity that once controlled your decisions begins to weaken. Situations that once triggered strong reactions now feel less binding. People that once felt emotionally necessary begin to feel less central to your inner stability. Not because you stop caring, but because caring is no longer mixed with fear of loss. And this is where real freedom begins to show itself. But before reaching that freedom, there is an uncomfortable phase, a phase where the mind feels unstable, where old identities feel like they are dissolving, where familiar emotional anchors no longer hold the same weight. And in this phase, the mind will try one last strategy. It will tell you that you are becoming lost, that you are becoming disconnected, that you are losing something essential. But what it is actually afraid of is very simple. It is afraid of not being in control anymore, because control was its way of creating the illusion of safety in a world that is always changing. But now you are beginning to see that control was never real safety. It was only temporary relief from uncertainty, and that relief always came at the cost of attachment. So when you let go, the mind reacts. But if you continue to observe without turning back, something shifts. The intensity of resistance begins to fade, not because the mind agrees, but because it loses the energy that comes from your identification with it. And in that space, a new kind of awareness becomes clearer, an awareness that does not need to control experience to remain stable, an awareness that does not collapse when thoughts change, an awareness that simply observes everything arising and passing without interference. And this is what the mind fears most. Not loss of external things, but loss of its authority over you. Because once you see through its patterns clearly, you can no longer be fully controlled by them. And that is why the moment you start letting go, your mind turns against you, not because you are going wrong, but because something inside it is finally losing the only thing it has ever known: attachment as identity. When everything you rely on disappears, something terrifying yet liberating finally begins to reveal itself. There is a stage in the journey of letting go that no one can fully prepare you for through words alone. You can understand it intellectually, you can hear about it, you can even imagine it, but when it begins to happen in your own experience, it feels completely different. It feels like loss. But deeper than that, it feels like everything you once used to stand on is no longer there. The mind does not describe it as transformation at first. It describes it as disappearance. The people you emotionally depended on feel less central. The habits that gave you comfort feel less satisfying. The beliefs that once gave meaning feel less convincing. Even your own sense of identity starts to feel less solid. And slowly, almost silently, you begin to notice something unsettling. Everything you used to rely on to feel stable is no longer holding you in the same way. Now understand this carefully. This is not punishment. This is not collapse. This is exposure. What is being exposed is not the world falling apart, but your dependence on things that were never meant to hold permanent stability in the first place. The Buddha described this directly. When attachment is removed, the illusion of solidity in conditioned things begins to fade, and what remains is direct seeing, without distortion. But the mind does not welcome this stage easily, because from the mind's perspective, stability is everything. The mind builds its entire sense of safety on continuity, on familiarity, on repetition, on predictable emotional structures. So when those structures begin to dissolve, the mind interprets it as danger. It says something is wrong. It says you are losing yourself. It says you are becoming empty. But what is actually happening is very different. What is dissolving is not your true self. It is everything you were leaning on to avoid seeing reality directly. And when those supports begin to disappear, something very raw begins to surface. You are left alone with experience itself. No filters, no emotional cushioning, no identity-based interpretation softening everything you see, just direct experience as it is. And this is where fear arises strongly, because most people have never learned how to exist without internal support systems built from attachment. The mind becomes very active at this stage. It starts trying to rebuild what is dissolving. It searches for new attachments. It replays old memories to recreate emotional familiarity. It projects future fears to regain a sense of control. It tries to convince you to go back to what felt stable before, even if that stability was only an illusion. And this internal struggle creates a very uncomfortable experience, because part of you is letting go, and another part of you is desperately trying to hold on. This creates tension, not in the external world, but inside awareness itself. But if you stay with this experience without escaping it, something very important begins to emerge. You begin to see that what you thought was stability was actually dependence, and dependence always requires something outside of you to behave in a certain way in order for you to feel okay inside. Now go deeper into this. Think about how many things in your life have been acting as emotional anchors. A certain person whose presence made you feel grounded, a certain role that gave you identity, a certain expectation about how life should unfold, a certain belief that made uncertainty feel manageable. You were not just experiencing these things, you were depending on them to regulate your internal world. And because of that, your peace was never truly independent. It was conditional. It existed only as long as external and internal conditions stayed aligned with your expectations. But life does not stay aligned. Life moves, and when it moves in a direction you did not prepare for, everything you depended on feels like it is disappearing. But in reality, nothing is being taken away. What is happening is that life is no longer matching your imagined structure of how it should be. Now here is the deeper truth. When everything you rely on disappears, what remains is not nothing. What remains is awareness without support systems. And this is where something both terrifying and liberating begins to reveal itself. Terrifying, because the mind has lost its usual reference points. Liberating, because for the first time, you are not experiencing life through layers of dependency. At first, this awareness feels unstable, because the mind interprets absence of attachment as absence of safety. But slowly, if you remain present, something begins to shift. You notice that even without external anchors, experience continues. Thoughts still arise, emotions still come and go, sensations still appear and disappear, but there is something underneath all of it that is not collapsing, something that is simply aware of everything happening, not reacting, not depending, not trying to stabilize experience, just observing. And this is where a very important realization begins to form. You were never actually supported by the things you thought were supporting you. They were part of experience, not the foundation of experience. They came and went within awareness, just like everything else. Now the mind may resist this realization because it feels like losing structure. But what is actually happening is the loss of illusion, not the loss of life. And once illusion begins to dissolve, something else becomes visible. The constant effort you are putting into maintaining emotional stability through attachment, the subtle tension of trying to keep things from changing, the unconscious fear of losing what you believed was necessary for your survival. All of it begins to become clearer, and with clarity comes something very quiet, a kind of stillness that is not created, a kind of peace that is not dependent. But before that peace becomes stable in your experience, there is usually a phase of disorientation, because the mind keeps expecting support where there is no longer attachment. It keeps searching for something to hold on to, even as you are learning not to hold. And this creates an internal contrast between old patterns of dependence and emerging awareness of non-dependence. This is why this stage feels both terrifying and liberating at the same time. Terrifying, because the familiar structure is dissolving. Liberating, because you are no longer trapped inside it. Now, if you do not escape this stage, if you do not rush back into old attachments just to feel safe again, something very profound begins to settle. You start realizing that safety was never coming from what you were holding. It was coming from your belief that you needed to hold it. And once that belief weakens, the entire structure of dependence begins to lose its authority. What remains is not emptiness in the fearful sense. It is openness without dependency. And in that openness, life is no longer something you must stabilize. It is something you simply witness, changing, moving, unpredictable, and no longer threatening, because nothing inside you is demanding it to stay still anymore. The pain you feel is not loss. It is your mind withdrawing from illusions it refused to let go. There is a point in this journey where the suffering becomes very confusing, because you are doing something that is supposed to bring clarity, yet internally it feels like you are breaking apart. You are letting go, but instead of peace there is discomfort. You are releasing attachments, but instead of lightness, there is heaviness. You are stepping away from dependence, but instead of freedom, there is emotional pain. And the mind quickly labels this experience, I am losing something. But what you are experiencing is not loss in the way you think. It is withdrawal. And this distinction changes everything. In Buddhist understanding, suffering is not only caused by external change, it is also caused by the internal resistance to breaking long-held patterns of attachment. When those patterns begin to dissolve, the mind reacts as if something essential is being removed. But what is being removed is not your true stability. It is illusion. Now understand this carefully. For a long time, your mind has built a network of attachments that it depends on for emotional regulation. People, identities, expectations, memories, roles, beliefs. Each one has been functioning like a support structure for your sense of self. You may not have consciously chosen this structure, but over time, it formed itself through repetition and emotional investment, and the mind came to rely on it. So when you begin letting go, you are not just removing surface-level preferences, you are disrupting an entire internal system that was designed to maintain familiarity. And the mind does not experience the removal of familiarity as neutral. It experiences it as danger. So what does it do? It produces pain, not because something is being destroyed externally, but because internally it is losing its reference points. Now, this pain is very important to understand correctly, because most people misinterpret it. They think pain means something is going wrong, but in this stage, pain often means something deeply ingrained is being seen clearly for the first time. It is not the destruction of truth. It is the weakening of illusion. The Buddha pointed out that ignorance is not just not knowing. It is also clinging to what is not permanent and expecting it to behave as if it is. When that expectation is broken by direct experience, discomfort arises. Now look closely at your own experience. When you begin detaching from something you are emotionally invested in, notice what happens inside. There is a tightening, there is resistance, there is emotional agitation, there is sometimes even a sense of emptiness or withdrawal. And the mind immediately interprets this as, I need this back to feel okay. But what is actually happening is simpler than that. Your mind is experiencing the absence of an old conditioning loop, a loop that repeatedly told it, this is stable, this is safe, this is who you are, this is what gives meaning. When that loop stops running, the mind does not immediately understand what is happening. so it reacts, and that reaction is what you feel as pain. Now go deeper. Think about how many emotional habits you have formed over time, how you react when someone changes their behavior, how you respond when expectations are not met, how you feel when a source of comfort is not available. These reactions are not random. They are conditioned responses built over time through repetition. And each time you engaged in those responses, you strengthened the illusion that they were necessary. So now, when you begin letting go, you are not just stopping an action, you are interrupting a deeply familiar emotional pattern, and interruption always creates friction. But here is the key insight. The pain is not telling you that you are losing something real. It is telling you that your mind is losing something familiar, and familiarity is not the same as truth. In fact, much of what feels emotionally necessary is simply what has been repeated long enough to feel unavoidable. Now consider something very important. If what you are releasing was truly essential for your existence, its absence would mean collapse. But what you notice instead is discomfort, not destruction. This is the difference between losing reality and losing illusion. Reality does not break when attachments dissolve. Illusions do. And when illusions break, they create emotional noise. But noise is not danger, it is transition. Now the mind does not like this interpretation, because if pain is not a sign of danger, then it loses its authority. So the mind tries to reframe the experience. It says you are becoming detached in a harmful way. It says you are losing emotional connection. It says you are going numb. But these interpretations are defense mechanisms. They are attempts to restore old patterns of attachment by making you doubt the process. Now here is what is actually happening beneath all of this. As attachment weakens, emotional dependency loses its grip, and when dependency weakens, the mind temporarily loses its usual structure of comfort. This creates a gap, and in that gap, pain arises. But that pain is not destruction. It is the mind adjusting to the absence of its own conditioning. Now, if you stay with this experience instead of running back into attachment, something begins to change slowly. The intensity of pain begins to fluctuate. It does not remain constant. It comes in waves, sometimes strong, sometimes weak, sometimes absent. And this fluctuation itself reveals something important. If something were truly essential, its absence would not fluctuate. It would be absolute collapse. But here, what you experience is not collapse, it is adjustment. And adjustment means change is happening, not destruction. Now go even deeper. As you continue observing, you start noticing something very subtle. Between waves of discomfort, there are moments of quiet, not emotional highs, not emotional lows, just neutrality, a sense of being present without strong attachment to anything in particular. And this neutrality is often overlooked because it feels simple, but this simplicity is important because it shows you that awareness itself does not depend on attachment to function. Thoughts can rise and fall, emotions can intensify and dissolve, but the fact that you are aware of all of it remains unchanged. This realization begins to shift your understanding of pain itself. Pain is no longer just something happening to you. It becomes something happening within awareness, and awareness is not damaged by it. Now the mind may still resist this understanding because it has built an identity around emotional continuity. But as you continue observing without reacting, the resistance begins to weaken, not because the mind agrees, but because it loses energy when not fed with identification. And slowly, something very important begins to emerge. You begin to separate experience from interpretation. You begin to see that pain is an experience, but suffering is the interpretation added on top of it. The raw sensation arises, but the mental story around it creates suffering. And when you stop feeding the story, something changes. The sensation remains, but the suffering begins to reduce. Now this is the deeper truth of this lesson. The pain you feel while letting go is not evidence that something is wrong. It is evidence that something false is losing influence. And what feels like emotional collapse is actually the restructuring of your inner world without illusion. At first it feels unstable, but underneath that instability is something very steady, the simple fact that awareness continues even when everything it once depended on begins to fade, and in that continuity of awareness, even in discomfort, a new kind of strength begins to appear, not the strength of holding on, but the strength of not needing to hold at all. The instant you see impermanence clearly, you stop negotiating with life. Because nothing was ever truly in your control, there is a final shift that happens on this path, and it is not dramatic in the way the mind expects. There is no sudden explosion of understanding, no final emotional breakthrough that announces itself loudly. Instead, something very quiet happens. You stop negotiating with life, and when that happens, everything you used to struggle with begins to lose its emotional weight. To understand this, you have to see what negotiating with life actually means. Most of your suffering has not been about what is happening. It has been about your inner demand that what is happening should be different, should be controlled, should be corrected, should be aligned with your expectations. You are constantly, silently bargaining with reality. This should not happen. This should last longer. This should be different. This should not leave me. This should stay stable. This inner dialogue runs almost continuously in the background of your mind. You may not always hear it clearly, but it shapes your emotional reactions to everything. And because of this, you are not just living your life, you are arguing with it. Now, the Buddha pointed directly to the root of this struggle, ignorance of impermanence. Not ignorance in the sense of stupidity, but ignorance in the sense of not seeing clearly how reality actually is. You assume permanence, where there is only movement. You assume control, where there is only cause and condition. You assume ownership, where there is only passing experience. And because of these assumptions, you live in constant tension with life itself. But when impermanence is seen clearly, not as a concept, but as direct experience, something fundamental shifts inside you. You stop arguing, not because you gave up, but because argument no longer makes sense. Now look closely at what impermanence actually reveals. It does not only show you that things change, it shows you that nothing ever stood still long enough to be controlled in the first place. Every moment is already disappearing as it appears. Every thought is already dissolving as it arises. Every emotion is already transforming while it is being felt. Even your sense of "I am here" is a continuous flow, not a fixed point. So what exactly were you trying to control? You begin to see that control was never interacting with reality. It was interacting with an idea of reality, a mental model of how things should stay. And when reality did not match the model, suffering was created. Now go deeper into your experience. Think about how much of your emotional energy has been spent trying to maintain certain states, trying to keep relationships from changing, trying to keep inner peace from being disturbed, trying to keep life aligned with expectations you never consciously questioned, trying to hold on to moments that were already leaving as you were experiencing them. This effort feels natural, only because it has been repeated for so long. But when you look at it clearly, it becomes obvious how exhausting it is to constantly try to stabilize something that is inherently unstable. Now here is the turning point. When impermanence is truly seen, not just understood, your relationship with experience changes. You stop trying to freeze life because you see that freezing life is impossible. You stop trying to extend moments because you see that moments do not stay to be extended. You stop trying to hold emotional states because you see that states are already moving on their own. And in that recognition, something very important happens. The internal resistance begins to fade, not because life becomes easier, but because you stop opposing what life already is. Now, this does not mean you become passive. It does not mean you stop caring. It means you stop fighting reality while it is happening. And this is where peace begins to emerge, not as an emotional state, but as a reduction of inner conflict. Because most suffering is not the event itself, it is the resistance to the event. Now the mind may still try to interfere at this stage. It may say, if you stop controlling, everything will fall apart. But this fear is based on a misunderstanding. It assumes that control was ever the reason things stayed together, But life has never depended on your control to function. Breathing continues without your control. Heartbeats continue without your control. Thoughts arise without your permission. Emotions shift without your instruction. Life has always been self-operating. Your control was only an interpretation layered on top of it. Now, as this becomes clearer, something very subtle begins to dissolve, the sense of personal ownership over outcomes. You begin to see that things were happening through conditions, not through personal command. And this removes a very deep psychological burden, the burden of responsibility over everything being a certain way. Now you are still involved in life, but not as the controller of life. You are part of the flow, not the director of the flow. And this shift changes everything internally. Because when you are no longer constantly trying to force life into alignment with expectation, energy is no longer trapped in resistance. Attention becomes freer, perception becomes clearer, experience becomes less distorted by emotional interference. Now, here is something very important. When people first reach this stage, they often misinterpret it. They think detachment means indifference. But that is not what is happening. What is actually happening is the removal of unnecessary struggle. You still feel, you still experience, you still engage, but you are no longer mentally arguing with what is already unfolding. Now go even deeper. There is a moment of realization that becomes very quiet, but very powerful. You begin to notice that everything you once tried to control was already happening without your input. Even decisions you believed were fully yours arose from conditions, influences, memories, and circumstances beyond conscious control. Even your reactions are shaped before you become aware of them. Even your thoughts appear before you decide to think them. So where exactly was the control you were defending? When you see this clearly, something fundamental collapses. Not your ability to function, but the illusion that you were ever the central controller of existence. And in that collapse, a strange kind of relief appears, because the pressure of trying to manage everything begins to dissolve. Now life is no longer something you must constantly negotiate with. It is something you witness unfolding, and because you are no longer fighting it internally, your experience becomes lighter, not because life changes, but because your resistance to it stops. Now impermanence is no longer a threat. It is simply the way things are. And when you stop resisting the way things are, something very deep becomes clear. There was never anything to win, nothing to secure, nothing to permanently hold, and nothing to permanently lose. Only movement, only change, only experience appearing and disappearing within awareness. And in that recognition, the need to negotiate with life disappears completely, because you finally see what was always true. Nothing was ever under your control in the first place. And now understand this, brother and sister. Nothing you were trying to hold was ever meant to stay in your hands. Not people, not moments, not feelings, not even your own identity. Everything was already moving before you tried to control it, and the suffering you called life was often just the resistance to that movement. Buddhism does not ask you to escape the world. It asks you to stop fighting what the world already is. Because the moment you stop negotiating with change, something very quiet appears underneath everything. Not excitement, not emptiness, but a clarity that does not depend on anything staying the same. And in that clarity, you realize something very simple, yet very final. You were never the one holding life. You were always the one watching it pass.